I thought I'd follow on from how Jerry concluded and just go through what I consider to be the 5 most important characteristics of a successful think tank. And I think it must start with a sense of idealism, a sense that you really can change the world. As Jerry's explained, one chicken farmer changed the world, but it's a model which every think tank must believe in passionately if they're going to make any difference at all. And from that sense of idealism, there should be a very strong set of principles by which one can judge any particular policy initiative that one wants to take. In the case of the Centre for Policy Studies, itself set up as, in part from the work of the IEA, we very strongly believe in liberty, free markets, the power of competition, individual responsibility. With those principles, whenever anyone comes through the door of our office with a brilliant idea, I can immediately judge whether that idea matches those principles and then whether it's worth proceeding to develop that idea and perhaps publish anything. Without those guidelines, one can just be a general sort of thinking place, and the most dangerous words for any think tank when they produce something is that this is an interesting contribution to the debate. That is damning. That is dreadful when that happens. That is basically just saying that has no sense of idealism in it. There's no sense of change behind that particular project. In more practical terms, there are 2 specific areas which think tanks can change. One is obviously coming up with brilliant ideas, which actually make it into policy. At the Centre for Policy Studies, we have a number of areas where that has happened, and these can be self-contained areas. We've done a lot of work on pension reform recently, which are now seeing the government take forward. They are true to our principles, and even with a government which is not necessarily wholly in agreement with our principles, it is still possible to influence political parties with very self-contained ideas. And indeed, it's very important to stress that sometimes those ideas can cross political boundaries. So, I think it was as long ago as 10 years ago that we advocated raising the level at which people start paying income tax to £10,000. We bashed away at the Conservative Party, saying this must be a good way of helping give poorer people more control of their own money. The Conservative Party said no, but then the Liberal Democrats took it up, and then 5 years ago, when the Conservative and Liberal Democrat coalition was formed, then that policy became government policy, and so we could claim that we actually achieved a great policy win. Policy wins in themselves are not enough. It's very important for any think tank to help create an environment in which their particular policies can thrive. This certainly involves the kind of work that Jerry was describing, where one is putting forward ideas, putting forward the framework within which explain our basic principles and explain perhaps even the morality behind those principles. That these may be very long-term ideas which one does not expect to be immediately taken up, but they are very important in helping to create an environment in which the particular policies can flourish. Another essential part of what I think think tanks should do, there's no point in us just being brilliant for the sake of it. We need to communicate. We need to tell the outside world what is happening for 2 reasons. Firstly, it helps to create the correct environment in which ideas can flourish. And secondly, it gives politicians the confidence to take forward ideas which they might otherwise find uncomfortable. If you can get a debate started in the media, then people have to respond to that debate, and sometimes it can be quite surprising that people who one might think are being too moderate can be persuaded by a vigorous debate to change their minds. And this comes, and this then leads into an absolutely crucial distinction which all think tanks should be aware of: the difference between popularity and being right. For politicians, being popular is always the guiding principle, and one can understand why. There are, of course, exceptions. Mrs. Thatcher would be one, but since Mrs. Thatcher's time in Britain, there have been remarkably few with whom one could say that being right was more important than being popular. But as think tanks, we don't have to worry about popularity. We do have to worry about being right, and being true to one's principles is the definition of what is right. We should always try to present our policies in such a way as that they can be seen to be popular. One can play clever games with sort of trying to get polling to see whether a policy proposal has broad support. A few years ago, we were campaigning in favour of grammar schools in Britain, and we did do some polling, and that showed that grammar schools are. This was at a time when the Conservative Party had set its face against grammar schools. We did some polling to show that, in fact, there was popular support for grammar schools, particularly in less well-off families. And it's wonderful that this morning the Conservative Party has reversed its previous proposals and is now going to open the first grammar school in Britain for 50 years. So, I'm not saying that it is always very difficult to measure the impact of the work we do as a think tank. Nobody ever says, thank you, that was your idea. We put it into action. There are no effective measurements for whether a think tank is successful or not. There are no metrics. I think it's almost in any other walk of life that I can think of. It's very easy to see what you are achieving, whether it's sales figures or readership or whatever. The ability to actually measure how successful think tanks' policies are is very difficult. I'd say the final characteristic of a successful think tank, to me, is its independence. It has to be seen to be independent. It has to be seen to be free to think of what it wishes. Its reputation for independence is crucial if it is seen to be dependent and influenced by a particular any particular organized or external group, then its ideas will always be discounted. And from independence comes some key attributes, I would say creativity, creative tension, and a challenge to the status quo. There's no point us just sitting around saying everything is fine. Our job is to be controversial, is to push politicians and wider political classes into areas which they are uncomfortable. It is to be disruptive, and it is to challenge as much of the current thinking as possible. That should be great fun, and it should be seen as something which one is when one has a public argument. That is a sign of success. As I say, the most deadening words are, that was an interesting contribution to the debate. That is failure. 5 things to avoid for a think tank. Clearly, as I say, the acceptance of the status quo. We always have to be pushing boundaries. We always have to be changing, and we always have to be thinking about how to change the world. We must be idealistic. We must not accept that because things are like this today, then they cannot be significantly changed tomorrow. There's always a danger of becoming too close to power. While it is very good to have constructive relations with politicians, equally you can get too close so that it is nice to be able to say, I was talking to the minister yesterday, but then you are in danger of becoming compromised in that you will not feel comfortable in putting forward challenging ideas that you might need to. One must also always be very wary and careful of being mistaken for lobbyists. It is, I'm sure Aidan's had the same problem, very frequently, at least half a dozen times a year, a large corporate organisation will knock on our door and say, we really like your work, Tim, most interesting, and we've got this absolutely fascinating problem, and it's something which, some regulations which really need looking at, and we'd like to support your work. And
you're talking about tobacco.
we don't take tobacco money, exactly. But they are certainly very, very blatant at doing this. We'd really like to support your work. We can make you a very significant donation to support your work. Oh, and by the way, would you like to do some papers on? I have very strict instructions from my board that we are absolutely not allowed to take any money from people who have a direct commercial interest in that particular project. So 6 times a year I have to say thank you, but I can't take your money, which, as I'm sure everyone around the room is in the same position, is never a easy thing to do. Another thing I think which we all have to avoid, and which I'm certainly guilty of far too often, is that sense of preaching to the converted. It is very easy to put forward ideas and policies and papers with which your peer group will always agree. That is not our job. Our job is to change the world. That means we have to preach to those who are outside the church or outside our congregation. And that means we should always be very aware of all the possibilities, not only of traditional media, but obviously more and more of new media. And the success of videos such as iPencil, which I'm sure you all know, shows that a brilliant communication can enable you to reach out to a far, far wider audience. And when the political classes are held in such repute throughout Western democracies, that kind of direct communication which new media allows you can be invaluable to break through to those who are disinterested in politics and to help the next generation come to mind. Finally, I'd say that the one thing which we must all be aware of, and it encapsulates perhaps everything I said, we must never be boring. We must never be boring. There is a danger in the think tank world of being earnest, it is a great responsibility that we all have, it is a great privilege that we all have. Our job is basically to find brilliant people with brilliant ideas and package those up for the political and media classes. But we must keep our sense of idealism, but also our sense of fun, and through doing that we will be listened to and responded to much more effectively. Thank you.
many of you are involved deeply in politics, and as our host said, one of the points of a think tank is really to advise politicians. Well, we see our role as advising politicians against their will.
Yes.
Or against their won't, as Ralph Harris used to say. Because often they can't do things, or they think they can't do things, because they think there is no public appetite for these things, or they think there's some reason why they're particularly impossible, or the trade unions are going to stop it, or whatever, and they think that this cannot be done. And one of the most useful things that we can do is to explain why it not only can be done, but should be done, and that other people around the world have done these impossible things, and somehow it seems to work, and it's really great. So we agree with Karl Marx. So the only point that we agree with Karl Marx on is that while philosophers have interpreted the world, the point, however, is to change it, and that's how we see ourselves. And we start, as Tim says, vitally important to start with a vision. And we believe in an open economy. We believe in proper free markets, not crony capitalism, not corruption, but proper open markets. We believe in competition, and we believe in choice. We don't believe in crony capitalism and corruption. We believe in choice. We even believe in competition in ideas. And when a left-wing group came to us 20 years ago and said, we're thinking of starting a new think tank, we sort of thought we'd make it a left-wing version of you. And they were asking me for ideas, and we were pleased to tell them, what works and what doesn't work, because we welcome the public debate. We want to have this debate about ideas. And it's amazing, as Jerry said, some of these highly influential think tanks around the world, and there are some that are amazingly successful, not just in the Anglo-Saxon sphere, have started from very small beginnings. I mean, I was working on Capitol Hill when Ed Fulner took over the Heritage Foundation, which had an office about the size of this room, with 2 people who didn't really have very much idea as to what they should be doing, and he took it over, and within a few years it became a multi-million-dollar organisation, and now it's one of the biggest think tanks on the planet, highly conservative. We started, again, just 2 of us. We had left Europe, joined the brain drain, gone to America, saw some good ideas, saw the Americans thinking of ideas that we knew didn't work in Europe, and we decided to come back to the UK. And we came back merely with our personal savings. We didn't have any funding at all, but we had the model of the Institute of Economic Affairs. We worked out that we could do something a little different, whereas the Institute of Economic Affairs was more sort of intellectual, that our strength was really in packaging ideas and making them more acceptable and communicating them more widely. And that really is what we've done. Of course, CPS was around at the same time, set up by Mrs. Thatcher and Keith Joseph. So it's a big world, and there are many different models, but I think that there are many things which a think tank can do. Firstly, I'll give you 10, if any of you are counting. Firstly, I run out after, I'm an economist, after 10 I can't do it. 10 I can do. Firstly, you can broaden the debate by putting forward ideas. We call this being a supermarket of ideas. When we were established, and certainly when the Institute of Economic Affairs was established in the 1950s, policy ideas really came from the politicians themselves. They came from the parties themselves. Those are the people who thought about what to do. And they didn't really take very much advice from other people. And the think tanks came in one by one, and they put forward these ideas. So we said, this is the model, that the politicians can now take their shopping trolley and they can walk through the think tanks of the world and taking ideas as they like. And that gives them much greater opportunities to develop and to inform policy and to ideas of things that can be done. So it's important that broadens the range of opportunities open to politicians. Secondly, you can broaden the public debate itself by publishing initiatives, publishing ideas. In particular, I think, taking ideas from other countries. We find this is extremely important. We say, this doesn't translate, but we say an ounce of theory is worth an ounce of practice is worth a pound of theory. I suppose you'd say, what a kilogram a gram of practice, of reality, is worth a kilogram of theory. If you can show that things have worked in other places, that's extremely important. People no longer then dismiss it as an idle idea. It's real. And you can organise, thirdly, you can organise seminars and breakfast meetings and lunch meetings and dinner meetings and so on, to bring people together and just to get people talking about these new ideas. And we hold events with think tankers and others of different political persuasions. We just want to get people talking so that, we hope that they will learn something from our ideas and experience, and sometimes, quite often, we learn a bit from them, and even if it's only understanding what the arguments are that we've got to deal with, because we can propose a wonderful free market policy, but it might get stopped immediately because there is some sort of cultural problem or something that we don't really appreciate that just stops it stone dead. So we have to work out, right, if there's a blockage there, how do we get around it? Can we get through it? Can we take people with us somehow? You have to engineer a policy. So you've got to understand what the culture is and the environment in which you're talking. Important on this is bringing people from abroad. I mean, I do quite a lot of travel to various places, but we also bring in lots of people, and indeed Milton Friedman was, our first meeting was one where we brought in Milton Friedman. And that, I think, is extremely important because you learn things from other people with practical experience, but also theoretical experience in other countries, who might see things completely differently. And you think, yes, that's no longer a blockage. We could do something else. We could go this way, and we'd have the same impact. Or we could do lots of little things and have the same impact. So we've brought lots of people from abroad to talk about. Jerry talked about policing in New York. That has actually influenced people all over the world, because people like Lord Bratton, the police director in New York, who established the broken window theory and decided to clean up petty crime and so on. And New York has just been transformed in the process. It's just amazing. Fifthly, obviously, you can write for newspapers, magazines, you can appear on radio and TV, putting forward new ideas and different points of view. We famously had an article in a magazine in the 1980s with some examples around the world saying how you don't need local services like cleaning the streets and taking the garbage, the rubbish away. Those don't have to be done by local government workers. You can get private companies to do those, and they can probably do it very much cheaper and better for different reasons, which I can explain. And so we looked around the world and said, yes, well, in this country they privatise this local service, in this country they privatise another local service. And we wrote an article about this. And Mrs. Thatcher read that article immediately, and in total breach of copyright, printed 20,000 copies and sent it to every Conservative local government officer in the country and told them to do it, whereupon they did it. So now, many of our local services are provided by private contractors, and the local government actually has very much more control over them because they can fire them if they are not doing a good job. They couldn't do that with their own workers. It's just impossible. So you can use the media in those ways. But, as Tim says, you have to be independent. If you go on the radio or the TV and you're just trying to be an apologist for a politician, they will treat you as if you are a politician, and you'll get shredded. You have to go in and say, well, you know, the government is doing some good things, as you do, some good things, but they're getting a lot wrong, and this is what they're getting wrong, and if they would fix that, then it would be much better. So you have to be independent, and if the politicians that you tend to side with are actually clever people, they will recognise, yes, thank you, you know, you're backing us up on the important things, you're criticising us on things that we should be criticised on. So you've got to be able to stand back and criticise politicians. You can do much of this online. We have a big internet presence, many think tanks do now, and one of the things you discover from an internet presence is how you pick up new people. There's a whole community out there of people who may agree with your views, but who can't get involved in the normal channels. They can get involved online, they can comment on your blog pieces, they can submit papers and so on. They can be activists. So that, I think, is another very important thing. You can organise events that bring business people and public servants together and academics together so that they can all share their different views. You can send submissions to government directly as to what you think they should do. I've just been invited to testify to Congress, on the US Congress, on deregulation in Britain, which I'm not going to do because there hasn't been much deregulation in Britain. And I'm quite critical of the policy, so I'm not going to do it. But you can submit papers directly to government, and I'm sure you do. We see that actually as a small part of what we do. I always say that you can go to a politician and tell them to do something, and they will nod very sagely and say, yes, you're very wise, yes, we should do this. And tomorrow, somebody else will be going in and telling them to do exactly the opposite, and they will nod very sagely and say, yes, thank you very much for coming in. And then nothing will happen. What we try to do... a familiar story. What we try to do is, I say, come at them stereophonically. If you have an online presence, if you are on the TV and radio, if you can get other people to go on TV and radio and to write in the newspapers, and you can stimulate politicians to think, why don't you write something about this idea? Here's some good ideas from abroad. Then you're coming at them from all sides. So they may not know that it was you, and often you don't get the credit for doing it, but you get the idea into play because the politician thinks so many people are talking about this. I should be doing this. And so when they stand up in Parliament and say, this is what we're going to do, it's not new anymore, everybody's discussing the idea, but you've done that, you've made the difference. So I'm very much in favour of coming stereophonically to politicians rather than going directly to them. Another thing you can do is you can organise stunts of various sorts. We have a think tank in Britain called the Taxpayers Alliance, which organises various stunts. In fact, my son worked for them over a summer, and they had a stunt which was that they worked out that lots of local city government officers were earning a lot of money, and that the chief executive of one of the poorest boroughs in London, poorest parts of London, the chief executive of the local government was earning more than the Prime Minister. In fact, he was earning about twice as much as the Prime Minister. So the Taxpayers Alliance organised a photo call for newspapers, and they arranged for this white Rolls Royce to drive up and park itself outside the council offices so they could all take pictures. And, and my son's job was to distract the security guards so that they didn't notice that the white Rolls Royce was coming up. And then he got to ride back home in the white Rolls Royce, which was great fun. But it's the sort of thing where you're doing something which is very visual in order to make an impact, which you might, you can write a letter to the paper saying it's outrageous that the chief executive of this part of this city is earning so much money, but it has no impact. You know, if there's a white Rolls Royce, people, yeah, right, that's terrible. Whether you need this, you know, champagne glasses or whatever. And so stunts is another thing you can do. But 10, lastly, I think one of the most useful things you can do is to do things which draw in the next generation. And we're strong on this. Gary's been strong on this too. You know, really since we started. Organising schools conferences, going to speak at schools, going to speak at debates in universities. I do a lot of this. It's very time-consuming, and yet I remember when Jerry talked about Ralph Harris, the first director of the Institute of Economic Affairs, and he used to come all the way up to us in Scotland, in St Andrews, and give talks to our society, and we've never forgotten that. It's an important link, and so we, to some extent, are the products of the Institute of Economic Affairs, because when we were at university, they were the only people saying the things that we wanted to hear and write about and talk about, and we were invited to come down to London and go to meetings at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and we see it as a sort of intergenerational contract. Now we do the same with other students, build them up, and they will probably be leading the think tanks of tomorrow, and hopefully they will do the same again. And of course we have a lot of things online and so on. So change can happen. I mean, I remember I first came to Budapest about 25 years ago, and it was a pretty dismal place, I have to say. It was dark and miserable, and the air smelled of oil. All the streets smelled of oil from the two-stroke engines of the trabbies, which were the only vehicles, apart from the government offices in there, Mercedes, of course. And there was barbed wire to stop you getting onto the river and all the rest of it. And it was terrible. And I've come back several times since, and the change has been amazing. So you can change things. As Tim said, you don't know how long it's going to take to change. Sometimes you can plug away for 25 years before an idea comes through. Sometimes it just comes like that. That's amazing. So what we do is we push on lots of doors, and always pushing ideas. And then from time to time you'll just hear a sort of creak. And you think, right, if we put some more resources into that one, we're going to make some progress there. And that's really how we work. So it's a big world. It's a very diverse world. But can we change it? Yes, we can.